The sun blazed down on the cobblestone courtyard outside Buckingham Palace. Tourists from all corners of the world gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous changing of the guard ceremony. The air buzzed with excitement as families posed for photos and children pointed at the palace windows, wondering if the Queen might appear. Among the crowd stood Marcus Wellington, a tall man in his early 30s wearing expensive sunglasses and designer clothes. He had flown in from New York just 3 days ago, and his attitude showed he wasn't particularly impressed by British traditions. He clutched a triple scoop ice cream cone in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling through social media posts while his girlfriend, Sarah, tried to get him interested in the historic building before them. The royal guard stood at attention in their iconic red tunics and tall bearskin caps. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers dressed up for tourists. Each guard was a fully trained military professional who had earned their position through rigorous training and dedication. They stood perfectly still, rifles at their sides, eyes forward, maintaining the discipline that had made the Queen's Guard famous worldwide. Marcus barely glanced at them. He was more interested in finding the perfect angle for his social media photos. He wanted shots that would make his friends back home jealous, something that would get hundreds of likes. Sarah suggested they stand near the guards for a photo, but Marcus had other ideas brewing in his mind. The temperature continued to rise as the afternoon wore on. Marcus's ice cream began melting faster than he could eat it. Creamy vanilla dripped down the cone onto his fingers and he grew increasingly annoyed. He looked around for a trash bin but didn't see one nearby. His eyes landed on the guard standing nearest to him, a young man with a stoic expression who hadn't moved a muscle in the past 20 minutes. An idea formed in Marcus's head, one that made him smirk. He turned to Sarah and whispered something that made her eyes widen. She shook her head and grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but Marcus shrugged her off. He had already decided this would make for viral content, the kind of video that would get millions of views. Other tourists nearby noticed Marcus pushing his way closer to the guard. Some sensed something was about to happen and pulled out their phones. The atmosphere shifted slightly, though the guard himself remained motionless, unaware of what was coming. His name was James Morrison, a corporal in the British Army who had served 2 tours overseas before earning his position at the palace. He took his duty seriously and had trained himself to ignore distractions, no matter how unusual. Marcus stepped right up to the edge of the designated boundary line. He held up his phone with one hand, ready to record, while the melting ice cream dripped steadily from his other hand. A few people in the crowd gasped softly, anticipating what might happen next. Sarah called out to Marcus one more time, begging him to stop and think about what he was doing. But her voice was lost in the general noise of the crowd. The moment hung in the air like a balloon about to pop. Marcus pressed record on his phone, angled it to capture both himself and the guard, and then did something that shocked everyone watching. He reached out with his ice cream cone and deliberately smeared it across the pristine white belt that crossed the guard's red tunic. Vanilla ice cream spread across the military uniform like a stain, dripping down onto the perfectly polished brass buckle. The crowd erupted in gasps and angry mutters. Several tourists shouted in protest, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Children looked confused, asking their parents what was happening. Marcus laughed loudly, clearly pleased with himself, thinking he had just created the perfect viral moment. He kept his phone recording, expecting the guard to break character, to react with anger or confusion that Marcus could capture on video. But Corporal Morrison did something unexpected. For several long seconds he remained absolutely still. His training kicked in and his face showed no emotion whatsoever. The ice cream dripped down his uniform, but he didn't acknowledge it. Marcus's smile began to fade slightly as he realized the guard wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted. The other tourists fell silent, watching to see what would happen next. Then, with military precision, Corporal Morrison's eyes shifted. He didn't turn his head, but his gaze moved to look directly at Marcus. It was the kind of look that soldiers develop after years of service, a look that could convey volumes without a single word being spoken. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm weather. Something in those eyes told him he had made a serious mistake. What Marcus didn't know was that disrespecting a royal guard wasn't just rude behavior. It was actually a criminal offense under British law. The guards had authority to respond to threats and disrespect, and they were backed by armed police who patrolled the palace grounds. Marcus was about to learn a lesson about respect, tradition, and consequences that he would never forget. His phone was still recording, but the viral moment he was about to capture would be very different from what he had imagined. The guard's hand moved toward the whistle attached to his uniform, and Marcus suddenly realized that his joke might have serious consequences. Sarah covered her face with her hands, already embarrassed beyond words. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised, ready to document what would happen next. The afternoon that Marcus had thought would be filled with casual sightseeing and social media posts was about to take a very dramatic turn. Corporal Morrison brought the whistle to his lips and blew 3 sharp blasts that cut through the air like a knife. The sound echoed across the courtyard, immediately commanding attention from everyone present. Within seconds, 2 armed police officers appeared from their posts near the palace gates, moving with purposeful strides toward the commotion. Marcus's confident smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of growing panic. The other royal guards remained at their posts, but their attention had shifted to the situation. This was protocol. When one guard signaled for assistance, the others maintained their positions while backup arrived to handle the disturbance. The system had been perfected over centuries, and it worked flawlessly. Marcus stood frozen, his phone still recording, the melting ice cream cone hanging forgotten in his other hand. One of the police officers, a stern woman in her 40s named Constable Davies, reached Marcus first. Her voice was calm but firm as she asked him to step away from the guard and put down his belongings. Marcus tried to protest, his American accent becoming more pronounced as stress crept into his voice. He attempted to explain that it was just a joke, just something for social media, nothing serious. Constable Davies was unimpressed. She had dealt with disrespectful tourists before, though most didn't go as far as physically touching the guards. Sarah rushed forward, apologizing profusely, trying to explain that her boyfriend didn't understand the seriousness of what he had done. Her face was red with embarrassment and tears threatened to spill from her eyes. She had warned Marcus, had told him this was a bad idea, but he hadn't listened. Now they were both caught up in a situation that was spiraling out of control. The other police officer, a younger man named Constable Patel, gently but firmly asked her to step back while they dealt with Marcus. Meanwhile, Corporal Morrison finally allowed himself to move. With precise military bearing, he stepped back from his post, keeping his rifle secured as he had been trained. Another guard immediately moved into position to take over his spot, maintaining the continuous watch that was part of the Royal Guard tradition. Morrison looked down at his stained uniform, his jaw tight with controlled anger. This uniform represented his country, his regiment, and his personal honor. The disrespect shown to it was not something he would forget quickly. Constable Davies asked Marcus for his passport and identification. Marcus fumbled in his pockets, his hands shaking slightly as reality began to sink in. This wasn't going to be a funny story he could laugh about over drinks. This was serious trouble. He pulled out his passport with trembling fingers and handed it over. The officer examined it carefully, noting his information while Constable Patel took photographs of the stained uniform and the scene around them for their report. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, forming a complete circle around the incident. Everyone had their phones out now, recording the aftermath of Marcus's foolish decision. He could hear people talking in different languages, some sounding sympathetic to the guard, others expressing disgust at what Marcus had done. A few American tourists in the crowd looked particularly embarrassed, as if Marcus's behavior reflected poorly on all visitors from the United States. Corporal Morrison stood at attention while his uniform was photographed for evidence. His face remained expressionless, but inside he was processing the situation. In his years of service, he had endured extreme weather, boring hours of standing perfectly still, tourists who got too close, and even the occasional rude comment. But being physically assaulted with food was a new low. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had stood in this same spot, maintaining this same dignity, and felt a deep sense of responsibility to respond appropriately. Constable Davies informed Marcus that he was being detained for assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces on duty. The word assault hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. Assault? It was just ice cream. It was just a prank. How could it be assault? He tried to argue, his voice rising, but the constable cut him off with a sharp look that told him arguing would only make things worse. She explained that any unwanted physical contact with a military member on duty was considered assault under British law, and the fact that it was caught on multiple cameras from multiple angles made the evidence overwhelming. Sarah was crying openly now, asking what would happen to them. Would they go to jail? Would they be deported? Constable Patel's voice softened slightly as he explained to her that she wasn't in trouble since she hadn't done anything wrong. However, Marcus would need to come with them to the station for questioning and processing. Depending on how seriously the Crown Prosecution Service viewed the offense, he could face charges that might result in a fine, a criminal record, or even jail time. Marcus's legs felt weak. A criminal record, jail, in a foreign country? This couldn't be happening. He looked at his phone, still recording the whole disaster. Part of him wanted to delete the video immediately, but he realized that wouldn't matter now. Dozens of other tourists had recorded everything from different angles. By tonight, this would probably be all over the internet, but not in the way he had imagined. Instead of being the clever American who got a reaction from a stoic guard, he would be the disrespectful fool who assaulted a British soldier. Corporal Morrison was asked if he wished to press charges. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Marcus wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say now that would make any difference? The damage was done, literally staining the guard's uniform and figuratively staining Marcus's entire trip to London. The corporal's response surprised everyone. He spoke in a clear, measured voice that carried authority despite being quiet. He said he would indeed support charges being filed, not out of personal vengeance, but because people needed to understand that the Royal Guard was not a tourist attraction to be mocked or disrespected. These were real soldiers doing a real job, and that job included protecting the royal family and upholding centuries of tradition. When visitors came to Britain, they were expected to respect British laws and British customs, just as British tourists were expected to respect the laws and customs of other countries. His words hung in the air, and even the crowd fell silent listening to him. Marcus felt smaller with each sentence, realizing the full weight of what he had done. This wasn't about one stained uniform that could be cleaned. This was about disrespecting an institution, a country, and a person who had dedicated his life to service. Marcus had come to London thinking himself superior, treating the experience as nothing more than content for his social media feed, and now he was paying the price for that arrogance. Constable Davies gestured for Marcus to follow her, and Constable Patel walked alongside to ensure he complied. As they led him away from the palace gates toward their vehicle, Marcus cast one last look back at Corporal Morrison. The guard had already returned to his duties, standing tall and proud despite the stain on his uniform. He had handled the situation with more grace and professionalism than Marcus had shown in his entire life. The lesson was beginning to sink in, but Marcus suspected it was going to get much harder before it was over. The police station was nothing like what Marcus had seen in movies. It was modern, clean, and bureaucratically efficient in a way that made everything feel even more serious. He sat in an interview room with plain white walls and a table bolted to the floor, waiting while the officers processed his case. Sarah had been allowed to wait in a separate area, and Marcus felt completely alone despite knowing she was somewhere in the building. Constable Davies entered with a folder containing witness statements and photographs. She sat across from Marcus and explained the formal process he was about to go through. First, they would conduct a recorded interview where he would have the opportunity to explain his actions. He was informed of his right to legal representation, which sent another wave of panic through his chest. He had never needed a lawyer before in his life. The constable recommended he contact the American embassy, but Marcus knew that calling them would mean his parents finding out, and that thought filled him with shame. The interview began with basic questions. Why had he done it? What was he thinking? Did he understand the seriousness of disrespecting a military member on duty? Marcus stumbled through his answers, trying to explain that it seemed funny at the time, that he didn't think it would be such a big deal, that people prank guards all the time in videos online. With each word, he realized how weak and foolish his excuses sounded. Constable Davies listened without judgment, simply writing down his responses with occasional clarifying questions. She then showed him the law he had violated. The text was clear and formal, explaining that assaulting any person, including military personnel, was a criminal offense punishable by up to 6 months in prison or a substantial fine. The assault didn't have to cause injury. Any unwanted physical contact qualified. Marcus felt sick reading the words. 6 months in prison? In a foreign country? His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, imagining himself locked away in a British jail, his career ruined, his future destroyed, all because of a stupid decision that had lasted mere seconds. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Corporal Morrison had been relieved from his post to file his own statement and change out of his soiled uniform. In the guards' quarters, his fellow soldiers gathered around him, some angry on his behalf, others making dark jokes about Americans and ice cream. Morrison appreciated their support but remained focused on the matter at hand. He wrote his statement carefully, documenting exactly what had happened without emotional embellishment. The facts spoke for themselves. His commanding officer, a seasoned major named Phillips, reviewed the statement and asked Morrison about his decision to press charges. The major explained that while Morrison was within his rights to do so, he wanted to ensure the corporal understood the full implications. Pressing charges could lead to a lengthy court process, media attention, and potentially turning Marcus into either a cautionary tale or a martyr, depending on how the public reacted. Morrison considered this carefully before confirming his decision. He believed in accountability, and letting this slide would only encourage others to think such behavior was acceptable. As evening fell over London, the story began spreading online. The videos taken by tourists at the scene had already been uploaded to various social media platforms, and they were gaining traction rapidly. Comments poured in from people around the world. The overwhelming majority sided with the guard, expressing outrage at Marcus's disrespectful behavior and praising Corporal Morrison's professional response. British users were particularly vocal, explaining to international audiences the significance and importance of the Royal Guard. However, a small but loud minority defended Marcus, arguing that the guards were essentially performers and that tourists should be allowed to interact with them freely. These comments sparked heated debates in the threads, with others pointing out that the guards were active military personnel, not actors at a theme park. The controversy grew as news outlets picked up the story, running headlines about the ice cream incident and debating whether the punishment fit the crime. Back at the police station, Marcus was finally allowed to see Sarah. She looked exhausted and worried, her makeup smeared from crying. They sat together in the waiting area while the police finalized their paperwork. Sarah admitted that she had called Marcus's parents knowing he would be angry, but believing they had a right to know. Marcus wanted to be upset with her, but he couldn't find the energy. He simply slumped in his chair, feeling the weight of his actions crushing down on him. His phone, which had been returned to him after the interview, kept buzzing with notifications. Against his better judgment, Marcus looked at the screen and immediately wished he hadn't. His social media accounts were exploding with activity, but not the kind he had hoped for. People had identified him from the videos, and his profiles were being flooded with angry messages calling him disrespectful, ignorant, and worse. His employer had already sent him an email requesting an urgent call about his conduct while representing the company abroad. Marcus realized his actions weren't just affecting his vacation, they were threatening his entire life back home. A duty solicitor arrived at the station, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who specialized in representing tourists in legal trouble. She reviewed Marcus's case quickly and spoke with him in a small consultation room. Her assessment was straightforward and not encouraging. Given the clear video evidence, multiple witness statements, and the victim's decision to press charges, Marcus would almost certainly be charged formally. The Crown Prosecution Service rarely dropped cases this clear-cut, especially ones involving disrespect to military personnel and national institutions. The solicitor explained his options. He could plead guilty, which might result in a lighter sentence and avoid a lengthy trial, or plead not guilty and fight the charges in court, which would require him to stay in Britain potentially for weeks or months, and would likely result in the same outcome, given the overwhelming evidence. She also warned him that even if he avoided jail time, a criminal conviction would affect his ability to travel internationally in the future, could impact his employment, and would remain on his record indefinitely. Marcus listened to all of this in stunned silence. How had a moment of stupid arrogance turned into this nightmare? He thought about posting that video, imagining it going viral, imagining himself becoming internet famous. Well, he had gotten his wish in the worst possible way. He was becoming famous, but as a cautionary tale, as an example of what not to do, as the ugly American who disrespected a British soldier. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. As night fell completely, Marcus was released on bail with conditions. He had to surrender his passport, report to the police station every other day, and remain in London until his court date, which was set for 3 weeks away. He also had to stay away from all royal residences, including Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and any location where the Royal Guard was stationed. The officer processing his release made these conditions very clear, warning him that violating any of them would result in immediate arrest and detention until trial. Walking out of the police station into the cool London night, Marcus felt completely defeated. Sarah walked beside him quietly, and they headed toward their hotel in silence. The city that had seemed so exciting just hours ago now felt hostile and unwelcoming. Marcus knew that tomorrow he would have to face the consequences of his actions, call his employer, deal with his angry parents, and somehow find a way to survive the next 3 weeks while waiting for his fate to be decided. The viral moment he had wanted so badly had happened, but the lesson it taught was one he would spend years trying to forget. The hotel room felt like a prison cell despite its comfortable furnishings. Marcus lay awake most of the night staring at the ceiling while Sarah slept fitfully beside him. His mind replayed the incident over and over, each time finding new details to regret. The look on Corporal Morrison's face, the gasps from the crowd, the moment he realized he had made a terrible mistake, all of it cycled through his thoughts in an endless loop of shame and anxiety. Morning came too quickly. Marcus's phone showed 47 missed calls from his parents and over 300 new social media notifications. He finally answered when his mother called for the 48th time. The conversation was painful, filled with his mother's tears and his father's barely controlled anger. They couldn't understand how their son, who they had raised to be respectful and thoughtful, could do something so stupid and disrespectful. His father, a veteran himself, was particularly disappointed, explaining that what Marcus had done wasn't just rude but a deep insult to anyone who had ever worn a military uniform. His employer's call came next. The marketing firm where Marcus worked as a social media manager was not pleased to discover that their employee had become internet infamous for all the wrong reasons. His boss explained that several clients had already contacted them, expressing concern about being associated with someone who showed such poor judgment, especially regarding social media behavior. The company was placing Marcus on unpaid leave pending the outcome of his legal case. If convicted, they would have no choice but to terminate his employment. The call ended with his boss suggesting that Marcus stay off social media entirely until this situation was resolved. Sarah tried to be supportive, but the strain was showing. Their vacation was ruined. They were stuck in London for 3 more weeks with limited funds since Marcus's income was now suspended, and she was dealing with her own embarrassment and anger. She had warned him not to do it, had literally tried to pull him away, but he hadn't listened. Now they were both paying the price for his arrogance. She spent most of the morning contacting their airline about changing their return tickets and looking into cheaper accommodation, since their hotel was too expensive for an extended stay. Meanwhile, the story continued to grow online. Major news outlets had picked it up, running segments about disrespectful tourist behavior and the importance of cultural awareness when traveling abroad. Travel bloggers wrote articles about etiquette around the world, using Marcus as a prime example of what not to do. The Royal Guard Association released a statement supporting Corporal Morrison and reminding the public that the guards were active soldiers, deserving of respect and dignity. The statement was shared thousands of times, with most comments expressing support for the guards and condemnation for Marcus. A few journalists tracked down Marcus's hotel and called requesting interviews. He declined all of them on his solicitor's advice, but that didn't stop them from writing articles anyway. Some reporters dug into his social media history, finding old posts where he had made jokes about British culture and complained about uptight European traditions. These posts were screenshot and shared widely, painting Marcus as an entitled American with no respect for other cultures. The narrative was being written without his input, and it was not flattering. By the 3rd day, Marcus ventured out of the hotel for his required police station check-in. The walk there was uncomfortable, with several people on the street giving him looks of recognition. One older British man actually stopped to tell Marcus he should be ashamed of himself. that the Queen's Guard represented the finest traditions of British military service, and that tourists like him should be banned from the country. Marcus apologized quietly and hurried away, feeling his face burn with humiliation. At the police station, Constable Patel processed his check-in and mentioned that the Crown Prosecution Service had officially decided to move forward with charges. Marcus would be facing court in 2.5 weeks for assault on a military member. The constable's tone was professional but not unkind as he explained that Marcus should use this time to reflect seriously on his actions and perhaps find ways to demonstrate genuine remorse, as this might influence the magistrate's sentencing decision if he was found guilty. That evening, Marcus finally did something he should have done immediately. He wrote a genuine apology, not a public statement crafted by lawyers, but a real letter addressed to Corporal James Morrison. In it, he acknowledged the full weight of what he had done, explaining that he had been thoughtless, arrogant, and disrespectful. He apologized for treating the corporal's service as entertainment, for staining his uniform, and for failing to recognize the honor and sacrifice that standing guard represented. He asked for nothing in return, made no excuses, and simply expressed his deep regret for his actions. His solicitor agreed to forward the letter to Corporal Morrison through the proper channels. She warned Marcus that it might not change anything regarding his legal situation, but it was still the right thing to do. Marcus sealed the letter knowing that it wouldn't undo what he had done, but hoping it might at least show that he was capable of understanding why it was wrong. Days passed slowly. Marcus and Sarah moved to a budget hotel in a less touristy part of London to conserve their dwindling funds. Marcus spent his time reading about British military history, watching documentaries about the Royal Guard, and learning about the traditions he had so carelessly disrespected. He discovered that the bearskin caps were won through military victory, that the red tunics had been battle dress for centuries, and that serving in the Queen's Guard was considered one of the highest honors in the British Army. Each fact made his shame deepen. Sarah found work at a local cafe to help cover their expenses, and the routine of daily life began to establish itself in this strange limbo period. Marcus attended his check-ins at the police station, avoided all media contact, and slowly began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. It wasn't just about ice cream on a uniform. It was about showing respect for institutions bigger than himself, recognizing that his desire for social media fame didn't give him the right to treat others as props for his entertainment. One afternoon, his solicitor called with unexpected news. Corporal Morrison had received the letter and wanted to meet with Marcus before the court date. The solicitor was surprised by this development and warned Marcus that she wasn't sure what the corporal's intentions were. It could be an opportunity for Marcus to apologize in person, or it could be Morrison wanting to express his feelings about the incident directly. Either way, it was Marcus's choice whether to accept the meeting. Marcus agreed immediately. Whatever Corporal Morrison wanted to say to him, he deserved to hear it. They arranged to meet at a neutral location, a cafe near the barracks where Morrison was stationed. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days before the court date, giving Marcus exactly 1 week to prepare mentally for what would likely be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. That week crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus rehearsed what he might say, discarded prepared speeches in favor of just speaking from the heart, and tried to steel himself for whatever anger or disappointment Morrison might express. Sarah encouraged him, saying that this meeting was a chance for some kind of closure regardless of how the court case went. Marcus hoped she was right, but mostly he just felt he owed it to the corporal to face him man to man and accept whatever consequences came from that encounter. The night before the meeting, Marcus barely slept. He thought about his father's military service, about all the soldiers who had sacrificed so much, and about how cavalierly he had treated someone who represented that tradition. He promised himself that whatever happened in court, whatever happened with his job or his reputation, he would use this experience to become a better person. The lesson Corporal Morrison was teaching him was harsh, but it was one Marcus knew he desperately needed to learn. The cafe was quiet when Marcus arrived, deliberately choosing to come 15 minutes early. He ordered a coffee he didn't really want and sat at a corner table where he could watch the door. His hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around the warm cup, trying to steady his nerves. Every time the door opened, his heart jumped, but it was never Corporal Morrison. Just regular customers going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the significance of the meeting about to take place. At exactly 3 o'clock, the door opened and Corporal James Morrison walked in. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, and a casual jacket, and without his uniform he looked younger than Marcus had imagined, probably only 25 or 26. His posture was still military straight, though, and his eyes scanned the room with the practiced awareness of someone trained to assess situations quickly. When his gaze landed on Marcus, there was a moment of recognition, but his expression remained neutral. Marcus stood up immediately, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He wanted to say something, to break the ice, but his throat felt tight and the words wouldn't come. Morrison walked over and extended his hand in a formal handshake. Marcus took it, surprised by the gesture of basic courtesy after everything that had happened. They sat down across from each other, and for a long moment neither spoke. The weight of what had occurred hung between them like a physical presence. Morrison broke the silence first. His voice was calm and measured, the same tone he had used when speaking to Constable Davies at the palace. He thanked Marcus for agreeing to meet and for the letter, which he said he had read several times. Marcus started to apologize again, words tumbling out in a rushed stream, but Morrison held up a hand asking him to wait and listen first. Marcus nodded and forced himself to be quiet, knowing that he owed the corporal that much respect at least. The corporal began to speak about his service. He explained that he had joined the army at 18, following in his grandfather's footsteps. His grandfather had been a Royal Guard in the 1960s and had taught Morrison about the honor and responsibility that came with the position. Morrison had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, had seen friends wounded and killed, and had earned his place at Buckingham Palace through years of dedication and sacrifice. The uniform Marcus had stained wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of everything Morrison and his fellow soldiers stood for: duty, honor, service, and sacrifice. As Morrison spoke, Marcus felt his eyes beginning to burn with tears he fought to hold back. He had known intellectually that the guards were real soldiers, but hearing Morrison's story made it painfully personal. This wasn't just some random person in a costume. This was someone who had risked his life for his country, who had earned every stripe and medal he wore, who took his responsibilities seriously because they mattered. And Marcus had treated all of that like it was a joke, like it was worth less than a few likes on social media. Morrison then addressed the incident directly. He explained that what hurt most wasn't the ice cream or the ruined uniform. Those could be cleaned or replaced. What hurt was the complete lack of respect, the assumption that Morrison was just a prop for tourist entertainment rather than a person doing an important job. He said that in Afghanistan, people had depended on him to keep them safe, to stay alert, to maintain discipline even under fire. Standing guard at the palace required that same discipline and alertness, protecting the royal family and maintaining a tradition that stretched back centuries. When Marcus had smeared ice cream on his uniform, he had essentially said that none of that mattered, that Morrison's service was worthless. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had never thought about it from that perspective, had never considered what it meant from Morrison's point of view. He had been so focused on his own desire for attention, his own entertainment, that he had completely dehumanized the guard. Morrison wasn't a person to him in that moment, just an object to be used for content. The realization made Marcus feel sick with shame. He finally understood the full depth of his disrespect, and it was so much worse than he had imagined. Morrison paused to take a drink of the tea he had ordered, giving Marcus time to absorb what he had said. Then, surprisingly, his tone softened slightly. He said that he could tell from Marcus's letter that the remorse was genuine, that he had learned something from this experience. Morrison explained that he had agreed to meet because he wanted to understand why Marcus had done it, and he wanted Marcus to understand why it was wrong, not just legally but morally and ethically. Marcus finally found his voice. He spoke about his own arrogance, his obsession with social media validation, his assumption that because he was a tourist he could do whatever he wanted. He admitted that he had been raised better, that his own father was a veteran who would be ashamed of what Marcus had done, and that he had betrayed every value he claimed to hold. He wasn't making excuses, just trying to explain how he had allowed himself to become the kind of person who would do something so thoughtless and cruel. The words came from a place of genuine self-reflection, and Morrison listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Morrison was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said that he appreciated Marcus's honesty and his willingness to face him directly instead of hiding behind lawyers and press statements. He explained that the reason he was pressing charges wasn't vindictiveness but accountability. People needed to understand that actions had consequences, and that respect for others wasn't optional, especially when those others were serving their country. If Marcus had just gotten away with a warning, the lesson would be lost, both for him and for anyone else who might think similar behavior was acceptable. However, Morrison had something else to say. He explained that he would speak on Marcus's behalf at the court hearing, not to excuse what Marcus had done, but to acknowledge that he seemed genuinely remorseful and had taken steps to understand the gravity of his actions. Morrison believed in justice, but he also believed in redemption when it was earned through genuine change. He wanted the magistrate to know that while the offense was serious, the offender appeared to be learning from it. This didn't mean Marcus would avoid consequences, but it might influence the severity of those consequences. Marcus was stunned. After everything he had done, Morrison was willing to show him this kindness, this consideration. Fresh tears finally spilled down Marcus's cheeks, and he didn't try to hide them anymore. He thanked Morrison over and over, his voice breaking with emotion. Morrison remained composed but not cold, explaining that he was doing this not just for Marcus, but because he believed that people could grow from their mistakes if they truly wanted to. This was Morrison's way of modeling the values he had sworn to uphold, including mercy alongside justice. They talked for another hour, the conversation gradually becoming less formal. Morrison spoke about his love for military history and the pride he felt in being part of the Royal Guard tradition. Marcus shared his own background, his work in social media, and how this experience had forced him to completely rethink his relationship with online culture and the pursuit of viral fame. They discovered some common interests, discussing books and films, and by the end of the conversation, there was a mutual understanding that hadn't existed before. As they prepared to leave, Morrison offered one final piece of advice. He told Marcus to use this experience to become an advocate for respectful tourism and cultural awareness. If Marcus was going to be internet famous for this incident anyway, he might as well use that platform to teach others the lesson he had learned. Turn the viral moment into something positive by being honest about his mistake and explaining why it was wrong. That way, some good might come from the whole situation, and others might learn without having to go through what Marcus was going through. They shook hands again at the door, but this time there was a different feeling to it. Not quite friendship, but something like mutual respect between two people who had both learned something important. Marcus watched Morrison walk away down the London street, feeling something shift inside him. The court case was still coming. The consequences were still real. But for the first time since the incident, Marcus felt like maybe he could eventually forgive himself if he dedicated himself to being better, to doing better, to honoring the lesson Morrison had taught him. The courtroom was smaller than Marcus had expected, but no less intimidating for it. Wooden benches, formal portraits of judges past, and the royal coat of arms on the wall all reminded him of the seriousness of the situation. Sarah sat in the public gallery, having insisted on being there despite Marcus telling her she didn't have to come. His solicitor sat beside him at the defendant's table, her briefcase open with carefully organized documents ready for whatever the proceedings might require. Magistrate Helen Crawford entered the courtroom, and everyone stood as protocol demanded. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Marcus's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was it, the moment that would determine whether he would face jail time, a criminal record, and the permanent consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. He tried to steady his breathing as everyone sat back down and the clerk began reading the charges. The prosecution presented their case efficiently. They had video evidence from multiple angles, witness statements from tourists who had been present, photographs of the stained uniform, and Corporal Morrison's own account of the incident. The prosecutor explained that this was a clear case of assault on a military member performing their duties, motivated by nothing more than a desire for social media attention. She noted that such behavior was becoming increasingly common among tourists, and argued that a strong sentence was necessary to deter others from similar actions. When it came time for the defense, Marcus's solicitor stood and acknowledged that the facts were not in dispute. Marcus had indeed committed the offense as described. However, she asked the magistrate to consider several mitigating factors. Marcus had no prior criminal record, had shown genuine remorse through his letter to the victim, had agreed to meet with Corporal Morrison face-to-face, and had spent the past 3 weeks educating himself about British military traditions and the significance of the Royal Guard. She presented character references from Marcus's employer, despite his suspended status, and from his father, who had written about his son's typically respectful behavior and his own disappointment in this lapse of judgment. Then Corporal Morrison was called to give his victim impact statement. He walked to the witness stand in full dress uniform, every detail perfect, from his polished buttons to his precisely positioned cap. Marcus watched him approach, remembering their conversation at the cafe and the unexpected compassion Morrison had shown. The corporal was sworn in and began to speak, his military bearing evident in every word. Morrison described the incident and its immediate impact, explaining how it felt to be publicly humiliated while performing his duty. He spoke about the symbolic importance of the uniform and what the disrespect represented to him personally and to the institution he served. The magistrate listened intently, making occasional notes. Marcus felt his shame return in full force, hearing Morrison recount the incident in official terms for the court record. Every word was true, and there was no way to minimize or excuse what he had done. However, Morrison then did something unexpected. He told the court about Marcus's letter and their subsequent meeting. He explained that while the offense was serious and deserved consequences, he believed Marcus had undergone a genuine transformation in his understanding. Morrison stated that he had seen true remorse and a sincere desire to learn from the mistake. He said that while he fully supported the charges being brought, he hoped the court would consider that punishment should serve not only as deterrence, but also as an opportunity for rehabilitation and growth. The magistrate asked Morrison several questions, probing whether he felt pressured to make these statements or if he truly believed in Marcus's remorse. Morrison answered clearly that no one had pressured him. And yes, he genuinely believed that Marcus understood what he had done wrong and was committed to being better. It was a powerful moment, and Marcus felt tears threatening again as he realized the corporal was keeping his promise to speak on his behalf while still maintaining the truth about the seriousness of the offense. After Morrison stepped down, the magistrate asked if Marcus wished to address the court. His solicitor had prepared him for this possibility, but as Marcus stood up, he set aside the notes they had discussed. He spoke from his heart instead, his voice shaking but sincere. He apologized to Corporal Morrison directly, to the Royal Guard as an institution, to the British people for his disrespect of their traditions, and to his own family for embarrassing them. He explained that he had learned more in these 3 weeks than he had expected to learn in a lifetime, and that if the court gave him the opportunity, he would dedicate himself to using this experience to educate others about respect and cultural awareness. The magistrate listened to all of this without expression, then announced she would take a recess to consider her judgment. The wait was agonizing. Marcus sat with his solicitor, who reminded him that even with Morrison's statement, the magistrate could still impose jail time if she felt it was warranted. Sarah came down from the gallery to hold Marcus's hand, and they waited together in tense silence. 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. When court resumed, Magistrate Crawford delivered her judgment. She stated that the offense was indeed serious, and that disrespectful behavior toward military personnel could not and would not be tolerated. The videos of the incident had brought shame to Britain's hospitality and had insulted an honorable institution. However, she acknowledged the genuine remorse demonstrated by the defendant, the victim's statement supporting rehabilitation, and the lack of any prior criminal history. She also noted that the defendant had already suffered significant consequences through loss of employment, public humiliation, and the cost of extended stay in Britain. Therefore, her sentence was as follows. Marcus Wellington was found guilty of assault on a military member and would serve no jail time. Instead, he would pay a fine of £2,000 to be donated to a military charity supporting wounded veterans. He would perform 100 hours of community service upon his return to the United States, which would be monitored by the British Embassy. He would write a formal public apology to be shared on his social media accounts, explaining what he had done and why it was wrong, to serve as education for his followers and others. Finally, He would be banned from visiting any royal residences or military installations in the United Kingdom for 5 years, though he would be free to return to Britain for other tourism purposes after serving his community service. Marcus felt his knees go weak with relief. No jail time. A criminal record, yes, and consequences that would follow him, but nothing like what he had feared in his darkest moments. He thanked the magistrate, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah was crying in the gallery, this time with relief rather than worry. His solicitor nodded with satisfaction, having achieved the best possible outcome given the circumstances. After the proceedings concluded, Marcus sought out Corporal Morrison in the hallway outside the courtroom. They shook hands again, and Marcus thanked him profusely for his statement. Morrison simply nodded and told Marcus to make sure he kept his promise, to use this experience to do better and help others do better. It was a charge Marcus accepted with full sincerity. They parted ways with Marcus, watching the corporal walk away, uniform perfect as always, dignity intact despite everything. The next few days were a blur of activity. Marcus paid his fine, arranged for community service monitoring through proper channels, and wrote his public apology. The post was long, detailed, and brutally honest about his mistakes and what he had learned. He explained the full context of what the Royal Guard represented, shared some of what he had learned about their service and sacrifice, and urged his followers to approach travel with respect and humility. The post went viral, but this time for the right reasons. Thousands of people commented with support for his honesty and appreciation for the educational content. His employer contacted him after seeing the post. While they couldn't restore his position immediately due to client concerns, they offered him a new role developing educational content about cultural sensitivity and responsible social media use. It was a demotion of sorts with lower pay, but Marcus accepted gratefully. It felt like the right kind of work, turning his mistake into something meaningful. Marcus and Sarah finally flew home 3 weeks after the court date. His passport returned now that the legal proceedings were complete. At the airport, Marcus looked back at London one last time. The city that had been the scene of his greatest mistake had also been where he learned one of life's most important lessons. He thought about Corporal Morrison, still standing guard at the palace, still maintaining the traditions that Marcus had once thoughtlessly dismissed. The corporal's quick and decisive response, followed by his unexpected compassion, had taught Marcus about accountability, respect, and the possibility of redemption. On the plane, Marcus wrote in a journal he had started keeping during his extended stay. He wrote about everything he had learned, about the importance of seeing people as human beings rather than content opportunities, about respecting traditions and institutions even when you don't fully understand them, about the difference between punishment and learning.